If that anti-Muslimness law comes in, the United Kingdom will be inexorably heading towards becoming a Muslim state. We are taking in what I would define as barbarians. Rapes of girls taking place in public. None of it reported on mainstream media because it undermines the ideology. It hasn't been a foreign power. It hasn't been an attack by, a belligerent Russia. We've created these problems ourselves. If you believe in your culture and in your nation, you're far right. That's the government's definition. Every single political party, pretty much, is more interested in power. When people say to me, reform is the answer, I say, no, it isn't. It is nothing more than reform is perhaps even worse than the Conservative Party in the pursuit of power. What I've learnt of Nigel Farage, he doesn't actually have any political philosophy at all. He told Rupert, Lowe and me at dinner that that's all he wanted to do was make money. We're actually going suicidally empathetic. People aren't prepared to say it because it sounds prejudiced. What this country desperately needs is...
I'm pleased to welcome the first guest on this channel, leader of one of the UK's fastest ever growing political parties, Ben Habib. Enjoy the video and don't forget to subscribe. For many people, not all, but for many people, what you're doing now can seem like a bitter man who got a bit fed up with how things were happening at Reform, wasn't able to call the shots, and so you left and formed your own party, which at a time where we haven't got much time left is really dangerous because it's going to split the right vote. So that's it floating in people's minds. What do you say to people who think that way?
So, first of all, thank you very much, Emmanuel, for having me on. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak. As far as being bitter is concerned, nothing could be further from the truth. The only bitterness I feel is towards the last 30 years of governance in this country, which has brought this country to its knees in a constitutional, cultural, and economic way. In every single direction where I look, I see really massive challenges for the country, none of which was necessary, and the vast majority of which was created by the people who are charged with protecting us. And it's been our governing class that has delivered the country into the predicament in which it now finds itself. It hasn't been a foreign power. It hasn't been an attack by, a belligerent Russia or something. We've created these problems ourselves. And which brings me to your second point. People talk about splitting the vote. In order to reverse the damage that's been done to this country and to see off the threats we face, we need a political force in the United Kingdom which has got the intellectual capability and the braveness required and the fortitude, the strength required to hold its position, to identify what the problems are, do it in a non-divisive way, but get to the root causes of the problems, reveal what they are, and thereby reveal also, typically when you identify the root causes of problems, you almost automatically reveal the solutions. And that's the critical thing, revealing the solutions for the challenges this country, there's very significant challenges this country faces. None of the other political parties actually understand, in my mind, or if they do understand it, they certainly don't articulate it, what the challenges are that this country faces. And I would argue that every single political party, pretty much, with our exception, is more interested in power than it is in governing this country by principles which would return it to a position of safety and prosperity. That applies to the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party in spades, but it also applies to the Conservative Party and to Reform. The Conservative Party, as we know, Emmanuel, is part of the problem. They had 14 years in which to change the direction of travel for this country, and they didn't do it. And the people who were in office during those 14 years, many of them are still in the shadow cabinet. So the notion that the Conservative Party is going to suddenly rediscover its so-called right-wing roots and become small c conservative again, I think is really difficult to stomach. And then that leaves Reform. And I think this is where people think that, I might be splitting the vote. Reform is perhaps even worse than the Conservative Party in the pursuit of power. Reform is Nigel Farage, Farage's reform. And what I've learnt of Nigel Farage over the time that I've known him is that he doesn't actually have any political philosophy at all. He is he is the ultimate political expedient, a bit like Boris Johnson, phenomenal campaigner, doesn't really know what he believes from one day to the next, will try and curry favor with whatever constituency he's addressing. Now, the majority of his life, Nigel Farage has campaigned for a sovereign United Kingdom, leaving the EU, etc. But I would argue that the reason he took that position was because he realized that there was a significant minority of people in this country who wanted to leave the EU. And through proportional representation in the European Parliament, if he could be the champion for that cause, he would be repeatedly returned to a parliamentary position in the European Parliament. And that's exactly what happened. He was in the European Parliament for 20 years. But he would argue he's been fighting for Brexit for 20 years. But I would argue all he did was exploit the position that he knew he could exploit. And my evidence for saying that is that when we eventually won the referendum vote in 2016 and we voted to leave the EU, any true Brexiteer, any individual who really cared about leaving the EU properly, would then have doubled down on their campaign. They would have gone into supercharge mode. We've won the referendum. I've been campaigning this for 15 years or 20 years, whatever it was that Farage had been campaigning, for an independent United Kingdom by 2016. And I'm therefore now going to paint the picture that this country needs to look like. This is my vision of a post-Brexit Britain. But instead of doing that, as any true Brexiteer would have done, he left the political battlefield. He just absented himself in 2016. He said, the referendum's been won, I'm going to let the Tories get on with it. The same Tory party that had refused to actually deliver Brexit, at any time before that. And then he did the same thing in 2019. He knew that the withdrawal agreement was not delivering the country out of the European Union. There'll be multiple clips, Emmanuel, that you can go back and look at where he denounces the withdrawal agreement. But then all of a sudden, he stood down 317 candidates in the general election in 2019, Brexit Party candidates, gave Boris Johnson a clear run to victory. And his argument was that if we don't give Boris Johnson victory, we'll get a Jeremy Corbyn government, and there could be a second referendum, and we'll lose Brexit altogether. And I bought that argument at the time. But what really convinced me that this man doesn't believe in what he says is that instead of staying on the political battlefield after he delivered Boris Johnson into office, which, by his own justification was to avoid Jeremy Corbyn, and therefore he admitted that Boris Johnson's deal was less than ideal, instead of staying on the battlefield to fight for a genuine exit, he again disappeared off into the undergrowth. And he told me in 2020 he just wanted to make money. He actually told me. He told Rupert, Lowe, and me at dinner that that's all he wanted to do was make money. And so I know that the man is a political expedient. So when people say to me, reform is the answer, I say, no, it isn't. It is nothing more than a vehicle for Farage and his mates, whoever they are from time to time, to get into office. And we now are seeing that. What we're seeing is reform arguing, as Farage has done, against immigration for many, many years, taking on a Bangladeshi asylum seeker as one of its representatives. Reform who've denounced the Tories repeatedly, taking failed Tories into the party by the dozen. Reform that talked about the need for a small state and reduced spending, actually advocating for the removal of the cap on the two-child benefit. Reform which argued for lower taxes, ditching all its tax-cutting policies. And so he's all over the place. So when people say to me, you're going to split the vote, my response is, split what vote? The vote for the Tory party, which got us into this trouble and still has all the same characters in it that, or many of the same characters in it that are responsible for the issues we face? or split the vote for reform, which doesn't have a political philosophy and will pivot this way or that way in order to get power. It's basically Tories Mark II and slightly worse because it's all over the place. No, what this country desperately needs is serious principled politics based on solid foundations for the restoration of our sovereignty and our prosperity, our constitution and our culture. That's what this country needs. And it's not about splitting the vote, by the way, at the moment. Right now, it's all about winning the argument with the British electorate, making the case for the nation state of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, our Christian constitution, freedom of speech, our democracy, equality under the law, making that case, winning that debate with the electorate, as it were, and then delivering into government. That's the second stage, delivering into government people who will deliver on that mission. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I guess the big question is, what's the potential path to power? Because what you've just described, at the moment, like it or not, Reform are doing extremely well in the polls. And since the general election, their popularity seems to have been increasing and increasing. So some would say surely trying to go against that is a loser's battle, and B, at best just going to cause a dent in their growth rather than actually establishing Advance UK or yourself as the next leader of the government.
Well, I've never, ever shied away from a battle, no matter how stacked the odds might be against me. If I believe I'm doing the right thing, I will do it, irrespective of the odds. It doesn't matter to me that it's challenging. Life has always been challenging. Life is always challenging for all of us. We wouldn't have fought Hitler if we'd taken the view that the odds are stacked against us, because the odds were in 1939. He was armed up and on the front foot, and the United Kingdom was fast asleep at the wheel. But we still fought him, and we won. And so I take the view that given what I know about the Conservative Party and Reform, I'm obliged. It's not just that I may be whistling in the wind. People may think it's a quixotic battle, but it's a battle that I have to have, because if I don't have it, I'll go to my deathbed knowing that I knew these two parties were not right and I didn't challenge them. So that's the answer to the first thing. But from a practical perspective, I've never known the electorate more febrile than it is now. The two-party system had basically held pretty much until Boris Johnson completely trashed his mandate. But by the middle of 2022, beginning of 2023, the two-party system was dying. It was dying on its feet. It is now dead. The two-party system is gone. Labour are languishing in the polls. The Conservatives are languishing in the polls. And Reform is not surging ahead. It is leading in the polls, but it's not surging ahead. It seems to have hit a ceiling at 30, somewhere between 27% and 30%. So I think there's every opportunity to win the debate that I was referring to earlier. And through winning that debate, get the support of the British people. And we will judge the route to power, what is the best route to power, in 2028, 2029, depending on what the polls are showing then. But right now, I need to win the battle of the debate. I need to win the debate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, do you know what I mean? I love a fight, right? And I love a fighter. So just that spirit. Essentially, I'm sitting across a modern day Churchill. I love to see that. So at what point did you realize that a new political party was not only necessary from your opinion, but even possible? How did that come about?
So the first, I'd known the minute Farage came back into frontline politics, I knew things were going to be not brilliant, because I knew the individual by, when he made himself leader on the 3rd of June, 2024, when he came back into Reform, having been completely absent from Reform until that point, and having even declared at the beginning of the general election that he wasn't going to stand. He just suddenly came back in the middle of the general election. I knew at that point things are not right. And a new political force is almost certainly going to be needed. The first thing that I did, Emmanuel, you may recall this, was campaign vociferously for a democratization of reform, to try and get reform to put in proper checks and balances so that irrespective of what Farage may individually be like, the party would be able to carry uh, with integrity the hopes and aspirations of the British people. But I failed in that fight. I was not able to get reform to be democratized. And it's not democratized.
And I
And
think, Ben, just on that point as well, I think one of the questions or comments that often came from the outside looking in was that you were making a mountain out of a molehill with some of these details. And if you maybe can respond to that as whilst you unpack this further as well.
yeah, so it's not a mountain out of a molehill. If an organization is built on poor foundations, that organization will fail. And I think one of the reasons the Conservative Party has ceased to be conservative is because it isn't structured properly. It doesn't have in my mind, a proper constitution or a proper body of people that keeps the leadership in line. All organizations, all individuals, no matter how great and even the most principled people, need to have an organization around them that will challenge them, that will hold them to account, make sure they stay on the straight and narrow, and deliver whatever it is that they've committed to deliver. The Conservative Party didn't have any of that. Reform had none of it. Reform still has none of it. But particularly with a character like Farage, who is so strong, he's such a strong character, he's such a strong persona, that it was doubly necessary to have those checks and balances in place. Otherwise, there's no point, for the reasons I've already explained, there would be no point reform getting power. What I was hoping was that through the democratization of the party, good people would be able to come into the party and speak freely without the fear of being sacked by Farage, which is his typical modus operandi. And the next cabinet of this country, if we want this country to be saved, is going to have to comprise people of really Sansamite, Herculean intellectual capability and strength. And you're not going to get that with reform the way it's structured. So it wasn't an esoteric obsession with a small issue. It was trying to set the foundations of reform so that it could then deliver. But, they've shirked it. They'll say they've democratized the party. They haven't. So by November 2024, I'd given up on reform and I resigned from the party. But the first time I realized there was an opportunity to actually set up a new party was when they sacked Rupert Lowe and the manner in which they sacked him. Because I thought that should have revealed, and I think it did momentarily, though people have a very short memory. It revealed, the vindictiveness at the heart of reform and its preparedness to take someone like Rupert Lowe, who was in the midst of the party, a key member of the party, one of its 5 MPs, and make fictitious criminal complaints against him, fictitious bullying complaints against him, designed not just to remove him from the party, but designed to destroy him. And no party of principle that's going to save this country would behave in that way. If you behave in that way, you're not a party of principle. You're not an upstanding party. And so I thought that gave me the political gap, in people's minds to launch a new party successessily. And so
was that almost like, from your perspective, the world can see what you've been seeing behind the scenes? And
yeah, that's what I thought. And I thought the world did see it, but politics is very short term, and I think the world needs to repeatedly see what reform does until it wakes up to what reform is.
I wonder if it's short term or also how desperate people are to see a change to what we currently have, right? With Conservatives for the past decade and a half, Labour in the short time that they've been in, and how much damage and carnage they've caused, and it doesn't look like it's going to change. In fact, looks like it's just getting worse. And so people are really desperate to see them out. And at the moment, the best and most distinct option looks like reform, and the people that have the most likely chance to power right now looks like reform. So I wonder if for a lot of people, it's just like, do you know what? We can tolerate the disagreements. We can tolerate the differences. This is our best shot to change the status quo. Let's do it.
Well, let's just wait until 2028. You know, if Advance is polling at 40%, people can vote for us, right?
Yeah, true. So I guess, and on that point, this is, I mean, because I know we're talking about your exit from reform and things like that, but what you've done in the past couple of months is quite remarkable in and of itself. And, you know, being able, I remember seeing the launch and seeing you talking about how much money you'd invest personally once you hit the 30,000 members mark. And I thought, firstly, you know, that's, to even be able to put that in shows a lot of business success. So hats off to you there. But then on top of that, to be able to get that many people voting or joining as members, considering I've not really seen you on, you know, the LBCs as you once were before, or the GB Newses or the TalkTVs.
No,
So
they've all cancelled me. The minute they heard that I'd launched a new party, they cancelled me.
So what was that like, and how have you been able to do what you've done, even without the backing of mainstream media at all, or even a platforming?
So I said, just for people who are not familiar with this, when I launched the party on the 30th of June, the soft launch of the party, there was a self-imposed hurdle to which you've referred of 30,000 members before before we would apply to the Electoral Commission to be registered as a political party, because I wanted to test that I could actually get the support. And I chose 30,000 members because that's the membership that Reform had in May 2024. And I knew, therefore, that you can fight a general election with 30,000 members. So I thought, right, if I get to 30,000 members, I can fight a general election. And that gives me the mandate I need to run a political party. And I said I'd put £100,000 into the party if we can get to 30,000 members, and shoulder to shoulder with the people who trust me. We got to 30,000 members in 3 months. And we did that just through the power of social media, which has been phenomenal. This would not have been possible years ago. And we're continuing to grow. And I can tell you now, I spoke to Andrew Eborn yesterday. I was on I don't know if you know Andrew Eborn, but I was on a show with him. He's another presenter. And it was the first time I've said it. This is the second time I'm saying it. I now feel the same feeling I felt in May 2024, before the general election. And before the general election, I felt in my gut, from what I was seeing anecdotally, that Reform would get seats, that it was going to be a successful general election for Reform. I now have that feeling in my gut for the first time since I launched Advance. I have that feeling about Advance, that we have gone past the difficult formative stages and we are now going to be a successful party. Unless something goes dramatically wrong, we are going to be a political force, without a doubt, because the incoming emails and texts I'm getting from very capable people holding really good positions right across the political spectrum is phenomenal. And my message is getting out. I get texts from the US saying we completely endorse what you're doing. I got a text last night from a senior legal counsel in a petroleum company in Texas who said that they applaud the systematic and considered way I've gone about developing Advance. First the Constitution, then the membership, then setting out my vision, then creating policies, draft legislation, and so on. You may have heard me talk about all of this. And so the message is getting out there, and I can feel the momentum picking up. We're not obviously in the polls yet because no one's polling us, but I can feel the momentum building. And there will be a series of announcements that we'll be making in the new year. And of course, every announcement we make creates more momentum. So, you know, we will have the political wind behind us. I've had political headwinds, but I can now feel a tailwind being created.
Wow, I can see the glow in your face.
Yeah.
So where do you think the interest from the States has come from? Obviously, you know, it's been very well documented how supportive Elon Musk has been of what you're doing. Where do you think the US interest is coming from? Why are they so interested in what you're doing?
So there are many Americans who love the United Kingdom, who look at the United Kingdom as the bastion, or used to, as the bastion of modern democracy, bastion of free speech, where, you know, basically the country could be trusted beyond any other country in the world. We were that country. And the Americans look at it and they go, goodness, what the hell's going on in the UK? You know, why can't they get a grip? So there are many Americans who love this country and want this country to do well. And the vast majority of those Americans are of our political disposition, of my political disposition, believing in sovereignty, free speech, democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And they're the ones who are looking at advance, because I think they're also waking up to the falsity of reform. And so it's them who are looking at us. And of course, Elon Musk has been very helpful in putting us on the map by endorsing us.
Yeah. So with that, I know you've talked a lot about intellectual, I don't know if you've used the word intellectual capital, but having juggernauts around you, basically. So, you know, really capable and effective people. And it's obviously no secret that Tommy Robinson has really rallied behind you and what you're doing as well. So what's your relationship like with him, and how does that differ from what it would have been like at Reform? Because I know that the Reform leadership are not very fond of him, to say the least.
Yeah, so Farage hates him, I think, would be a reasonable way to describe the relationship between the two men. It's an extraordinary thing, because in the last general election, notwithstanding all the insults Farage had thrown at Tommy Robinson did endorse reform. He implored all his supporters to vote for reform. And irrespective of that, Farage just kept denouncing the man. And as far as I'm concerned, Tommy Robinson is a member of my party. All British citizens on the electoral roll are welcome to be members of our party. Obviously, when they join, they're endorsing our mission statement, our vision for the United Kingdom. And he clearly shares our vision of the United Kingdom. When he joins the party, though, we're not endorsing everything he's done. And I think Tommy Robinson would be one of the first people to admit he's had what we might call a colourful past. You know, but that doesn't make him a pariah. He's, you know, to the extent that he's done stuff in his youth and so on, and in his past, he's often paid the price for it. And what Tommy Robinson has done, which is really quite phenomenal compared to so many people, for the vast majority of people, particularly people coming from a working class background, is he stood against all these so-called intellectuals you referred to, and he called out a problem which none of them were prepared to call out very, very early on. And he did it in his own way, perhaps in a way they didn't like, because he used language that they don't like. But he called it out bravely, and he stood his ground. And we're now seeing that actually a lot of what he said was true. And, you know, it's coming to light. And people may not like him, and they're free not to like him. People don't have to like Tommy Robinson. It's irrelevant. But he has a following in the United Kingdom. There were 2.5 million people on X alone watching the Unite the Kingdom march when I was, which I spoke on the 13th of September in 2025, and this year. And must have been pushing 1 million people, certainly over 500,000 people actually there physically trying to listen. That's a democratic mandate. And instead of turning your back on the people who were there and passing them all as far right and denouncing them, I think the political class, including Farage and Kemi Badenoch, need to embrace what the British people are telling them. It's not about Tommy Robinson, it's about the people.
Yeah. Did you ever think Tommy Robinson was racist?
I didn't know him. I only met him recently. But, you know, everyone is classed as racist. It's the go-to insult, isn't it? People even accuse me of being racist, which I find really interesting because my dad's Pakistani, my mum's English. So, you know, which side hates which side? Does my white side hate my brown side, or my brown side hate my white side? But I can confirm, having met him, that he's not racist. And a lot of people with whom he's close are from multiple different ethnicities. You know, so I don't think he's racist. What he is, and what I am, and I think what you are culturalists. We believe in the culture, at least the culture that we once had in this country. That's what I believe in. And That's not racist. That wants the cultural settlement that we used to have. And a nation state is nothing more than its culture. And a culture is a shared language, a shared history, a shared sense of belonging, shared values, shared religion, perhaps, and so on. And that's what I stand for,
I
not
find it funny.
racism. Yeah,
Yeah, no, of course. I
yeah,
find it funny when I see people especially white people in liberal establishment talking about quoting things and saying, is this racist? This person's racist, that person's racist. Because, when you grow up around black people, Asian people, you hear them say some of the most racist things and we laugh
yeah.
about it and stuff. So when I see people tripping up at head over heels about it does make me laugh. But the reason I asked you that question is because I used to think before, when I was, of a very different mindset, that Tommy Robinson was a massive racist. And if you ask me why, I wouldn't have been able to explain it to you other than that's what everybody says. I've probably seen a few clips and formed an opinion of him as a thug and stuff, but had no real evidence behind my viewpoint of him. And then I started to learn a lot more about the stuff he would cover about the rape gangs, the Pakistani grooming gangs, and different things of that nature. And I thought, well, do you know what? I mean, that's absolutely correct. Those things are abhorrent. And when you start to see some of the documentaries and such, you realize that he wasn't being racist at all. That made me start to question, well, why have people gone to such lengths to portray him that way when the issue is not about race at all, but is about safety, protection, culture. And that, I think a lot of other people are also starting to realize that we were sold a lie in that sense. This is in no way to
Absolutely.
paint anybody as an angel, but it is to say, actually, there have been some people who really weaponized that. I think now people are hungry for political voices that can say that and can stop being scared to be associated with racist boogeymen and just stick to the facts and stick to the principle and stick to the discussion.
Absolutely. And we've got to stop it. Even Farage has been in the crosshairs of being accused of racism recently. And I was interviewed a few times over it. Do you think Farage is racist? And I don't think, for all my criticism of Nigel Farage, I don't think he's a racist. It's a misdirection. I think he's a bully, but he's not a racist. And, that's a different thing. But the reason Farage throws Tommy Robinson under a bus repeatedly is because he is currying favor with the establishment. It's another revelation, if you need it, of why you can't trust Farage. He's prepared to throw Tommy Robinson under a bus, even falsely accusing him of beating his wife when he absolutely has. He said, I think he said he was convicted of beating women or something to that effect. And he hasn't been. There's been no accusations against him for beating women. But Farage is prepared to do that to curry favor with the establishment. So then you have to ask yourself, without wishing to unnecessarily go back to what we were discussing earlier, you have to ask yourself, what kind of person is prepared to throw another human being under a bus just to advance their own political career? It's not good. Tommy Robinson, when he went to prison last year in 2024, was a political prisoner. That was a politically motivated imprisonment, no doubt. And any brave British politician who cares about equality under the law should have cited it as such.
But
And
why is
none
that?
of them did. What?
Why would you say that? Why would you say specifically a political prisoner?
He was a political prisoner because it was a civil action. So he had made a documentary about a Syrian boy who had a fracas with a white boy in a school. And there was a civil action by that boy and his family against Tommy Robinson, pursuant to which an injunction was put in place preventing Tommy Robinson from showing that film anymore. And Tommy Robinson didn't observe the injunction. Now, in a civil action, when you don't observe an injunction, typically what happens is you get a fine, you get an admonishment, you get a threat of further action if you don't take it down, and so on. But what happened in Tommy Robinson's case is that the Attorney General, a guy called Lord Hermer, who is a political appointment, the Attorney General, appointed by Starmer into office. In fact, Hermer doesn't even have a democratic mandate. He's not elected. He sits in the House of Lords. And he was made a Lord by Starmer so that he could make him Attorney General. Anyway, so Hermer decided that Tommy Robinson needs to face effectively criminal law, he decided that Tommy Robinson's breach of this injunction was a matter of national public interest, and therefore he should face the maximum possible penalty, which is incarceration. And he effectively took a civil action and made it criminal and directed the maximum punishment against Tommy Robinson. And the court then adjudicated on it and put him in prison. So it was a political appointed individual who was responsible for taking the action that put Tommy Robinson in jail. It didn't come about through the action of him breaching that injunction. And that is a really important distinction to make, that it was the Attorney General, who's a political animal, that motivated the case that put Tommy Robinson behind bars. It was a political imprisonment.
So that's literally two-tier justice, basically.
That is two-tier justice. And someone like Farage, if he cares about two-tier justice in this country, if he wants to put it right, needs to call it out. Kemi Badenoch the same. They should have called it out. And I did call it out at the time. I did say this is politically targeted. Look, I'm not an apologist for Tommy Robinson. I'm sure he's done shit in the past, without using an expletive to express the position. I'm sure he's done stuff in the past, but he is not the Voldemort that people make him out to be, and that was a political imprisonment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in a situation where if you can make a case that somebody's been wrongfully attacked by the legal system, in that specific instance, we should be apologists for them. In that specific instance, right?
Absolutely,
because
and I made the case for
defending
his rights. Yeah, his rights have to be. I'm not going to be an apologist for him right across the board, but on that specific issue, and no doubt on others as well, Emmanuel. No doubt on others, like him being arrested under the Terrorism Act. Did you follow all of that?
I did. Yeah, I did.
Which was the Tony Blair invention, the Terrorism Act 2000. He was stopped and required to hand over his phone. He's not, whatever Tommy Robinson is, there can be no reasonable grounds to think he's a terrorist. That is an absurdity. He's a public figure. He doesn't go around causing terrorism. But the constabulary wrongly used the law against him. And again, none of the politicians denounced it. I did. But none of the politicians had the courage to denounce it. And they should have done. Kemi Badenoch should have said, no, this is wrong. Farage said, no. She should have said, no, this is wrong. What's holding them back?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a real frustration that I have, and I think a lot of people have, is that the conclusions that our legal system seems to come to and what everyday people think is right and wrong are wildly different. So, for example, in that case, as you mentioned, specifically what happened, from what I understand, Tommy Robinson was asked to hand over his phone. He didn't. How that ends up being a case of terrorism is wild to me. But then you take a case where, for instance, what's his name? Hadish Kabatu, the Eritrean asylum seeker, was here 8 days, asylum seeker, here for 8 days, sexually assaulted 2 females, 1 child, 1 woman, and he was given a 12-month prison sentence.
It
didn't fall. But then I remember reading the story about Lucy Connolly and what she posted around that time. Whether what she posted was right or wrong is kind of beside the point. She would have spent more time in prison than this sex offender would have. And even though, you can, whether or not this or that is a crime or anything, it's just that you can tweet, from my perspective, you can tweet something and spend more time in prison than somebody who commits that kind of offense.
Yeah, it shows you how wrong.
It's civil is. Why is that the case?
So the country's gone completely wrong. Now, the reason I think it's happened is that there are a number of different reasons which have resulted in a number of different forces which have resulted in this. But at the heart of it is the Human Rights Act. And the Human Rights Act, or at the heart of it is the Human Rights Act, which basically has come to protect criminals more than it protects victims. I think the way it's working, Emmanuel, is that the victim's already been damaged. The victim's already suffered whatever the victim's going to suffer. Now it's the criminal on trial, and we're bending over backwards to ensure that criminals are not treated badly because their human rights could be risked. We've forgotten that actually they're on trial because there's an innocent individual who has suffered at their hands. We've forgotten what it means to be a criminal. That's one of the things at the heart of this. the other thing at the heart of this is that this country is pursuing what I would call extreme ideological forms of governance. Extreme in the sense that we're not prepared to enforce our borders, where we're prepared to take into our midst people who have no right to be here, who many of whom hate this country, would wish to do us damage. We're putting protective blankets around these people through diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I'm sure you've heard about and your viewers would have heard about, championing their rights, giving them much better treatment than people, veterans get, for example, in this country, and so on and so forth. Where the government is practicing extreme forms of ideology in its governance. Now, if you're practicing extreme forms of ideology, you won't get away with it if you let the people speak. If you let the people speak, the people will speak out against you, and you will be challenged. And that's why we've seen a reduction in our ability to speak freely. That's why we've seen things like non-crime hate incidents becoming an issue, existing even. Or we see Lucy Connolly going to prison. I think, was it 2 years and 8 months she was put in prison for? She may not have served all of it, but it was 2 years and 8 months, I think, was the entire prison. So they've got to clamp down on free speech, because otherwise their extreme ideologies would be revealed. That's also why they call people, as ridiculous as it might sound, call people far right, racist, xenophobic. They want to attack the individual and remove the validity of their argument by undermining the individual. And so that's where we've got to. And a misunderstanding of who is wrong in the criminal justice system. It's the victim who is the injured party, not the criminal. A misunderstanding there. We've lost an understanding there. And also this clamping down on free speech so these extreme ideologies can go unchecked.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, kind of wrapping a blanket around criminals, because there's I feel like there's a crisis in our country where strength and compassion are constantly rivals or constantly put at odds with each other. So whenever you communicate a strong position on anything, the question then comes back at you, well, what about the feelings of that person, or what about the situation of that person? Let me, on that point, I want to play for you a clip of your conversation with Julia Hartley Brewer a couple of years ago, where I think this is demonstrated best, and I want to get your reaction on it.
Agree with all of that at the point when they use the tactic of jumping into the sea and they're drowning. Are you saying that British Border Force and the British Navy will be instructed not to rescue those people from drowning?
No, you didn't hear me. I said that we could, as an idea, provide them with another dinghy into which to climb and then go back to France. And if they choose to scupper that dinghy, then yes, they have to suffer the consequences of their actions.
Then you would leave them to drown?
They cannot, absolutely, they cannot be infantilized to the point that
I have
we
no doubt, Ben,
become
that is a policy
fortune.
that would work quite well. However, that is not a policy that a civilized country should endorse.
Why is that uncivilized, Julia?
Because we don't leave people to drown, because we're civilized human beings.
Looking back at that now, when you look back at that clip now, what's your reflections on how we understand, strength and compassion and humanity and all these kind of things when it comes to enforcing our borders?
So I absolutely stand by everything I said in that clip. I shouldn't have allowed her to get the gotcha moment in which, in frustration, I said, well, if they repeatedly put themselves in harm's way, we've got to allow them to suffer the consequences of their own actions. And she said, do you mean you'd let them drown? And I said, well, if they keep doing that, you've got to let them take the responsibility for their... Do you mean that you'd let them drown? And I said in frustration, yes, I'd let them drown. Of course, I don't advocate drowning people in the Channel, which is how the whole thing was portrayed. I don't advocate that at all. But people must take responsibility for their actions. These people were perfectly safe, are perfectly safe in France. It is through their own decision to get in an extremely dangerous dinghy, which is presumably not very seaworthy, trying to cross the Channel illegally into our country. And once they've made that decision and they're trying to invade our country effectively, we must have the fortitude to intercept them and say, you are seeking to break into our country. That is not acceptable to us. Please turn around and go back to France. And they can be given 1 warning, 2 warnings. They can be given 5 warnings, 10 warnings. They can, in the example that she was using, that she said, what if a migrant got out a knife and stabbed their boat and they all ended up in the North Sea and they were drowning, what would happen? And you could give them another rescue boat and they could stab that boat, and you could give them one that was incapable of being stabbed. And then you could handcuff them and put them in the new boat, and then send them back to France. But whatever you do, whatever course of action our border force takes, they must never allow these people to land on British shores, because they are seeking. I mean, what we've forgotten is, it's a bit like, I don't know if you're old enough to have seen a film called Blazing Saddles. Have you seen Blazing Saddles?
Well, I haven't seen it, but I don't know if it's because of my age.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a very old film. It's got language in it that's unrepeatable in 2025. But there's a scene in it where the sheriff of the town, who's a black guy, puts a gun to his own head, and he tells all the town people who are about to shoot him, he says, put your weapons down or the black guy's going to get it. He uses another word. He says, put your weapons down or the black guy's going to use it. And he puts a gun to his own head. And so everyone lowers their weapons. It's just a joke. It's a really bad joke. And it's a bit like that with these people in the channel. They're saying, let us into your country or we're going to be drowning. And we go, well, fine, we'll take our defenses down. They put a gun to their own head, haven't they?
But Ben, do you think Julia didn't understand the point you were making there?
She wanted a gotcha moment, and I was stupid enough to give her a gotcha moment. I shouldn't have done that. And
why do you think that was the case?
Why?
Yeah, why was she looking? I'll tell you why I'm asking that question, because it seems like it's very clear that all of our media is very biased. There's no such thing as impartial media these days. And I don't even present myself as someone who's impartial, and I've obviously got my political biases. But the organizations like, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, TalkTV, GB News present themselves as these impartial media institutions. So if that's how you present yourself, then you have a duty to try and present the opinions as fairly and as honestly as possible. What I'm seeing there is the kind of thing I would expect if I was a left-leaning journalist debating you to get a gotcha moment. That's what I would have expected. And that makes me wonder, is all of our media completely compromised? Even the media that presents itself as free speech and right-leaning? What's going on?
I've had further experiences of Julia Hartley Brewer since then, private experiences, and indeed she's tweeted against me. And I would say Julia is a Tory type conservative, but not a very good Tory. She's also on the record herself saying that giving up Northern Ireland would be a price worth paying for Brexit. She said that in 2019. She would have been prepared to sacrifice part of the United Kingdom in order to get Brexit, which for me is just absolutely balmy. Absolutely balmy. She's also wrong on this point that it's, we can't stop the dinghies. The Belgians have a border force which patrols their own water, intercepts dinghies, and sends them straight back to shore. And no one stabs their own boat and ends up in the in the channel. No one is endangered by it. They just go back to shore. I think Julia is a wet Tory, which is why she likes Farage.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in all honesty, I mean, I think that's a point that you should double down on. It's very clear that nobody wants to see anybody drown. It's not difficult to see that. And it's also very clear that if somebody refuses 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rescue attempts, at some point continuing to try and rescue them actually endangers the rescuer.
Absolutely.
It's very clear, very common sense. And I think that's where we are. It's really one thing that frustrates me, and I think a lot of viewers or the ordinary people looking at the political discourse, is there's so much virtue signaling where we always have to, or politicians always want to look extremely virtuous and extremely holy to the point where there's suicidal empathy. Let's all be honest. If you were helping somebody drowning just personally, and after 6 or 7 attempts, they kept on kicking you away, what are you going to do?
Yeah, what are you going to do? So that was the point I was making to her. And if you watch the whole clip, if viewers take the trouble to watch the whole clip, they'll see that I gave multiple opportunities for this would-be self-drowner not to be drowned. But the clip that gets played is just the bit where I said, then let them drown. That's the bit that they play.
How for somebody who's not as versed in this world as you, the average Joe, gets up, works hard, goes home, maybe watches a bit of YouTube at night, flicks through the media every now and again. How would you
Sounds a
describe
bit
to
like
them?
me, yeah.
Oh, well, except for the interviewing parts and leading the political party part. How would you describe to them the crisis that we're facing and the cause of it? You touched on it a bit before, that it's all self-inflicted. How would you describe to them what that crisis actually is and how it's self-inflicted?
Okay, so there are a number of different reasons for it. I mean, how long have you got? But
As long as you've got.
okay, so I think one of the big contributors to the problem we face is the notion that we live in a liberal democracy. And people say that without really thinking what it means. Liberalism is the championing of the individual's rights, and democracy is the championing of the majority's rights. And they are often in tension with each other. And it can be a healthy tension, because obviously individuals do need protections in society. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to go about confident that the majority doesn't turn into a mob and kill us. So you do need some form of liberalism, as it were, in society. But you do need the majority's views and the interests of the majority to prevail. And it is through getting a good balance between liberalism and democracy that the country can flourish and people can go about their business assured of their personal safety, but that decisions are made for the majority interest nevertheless. We used to have that kind of settlement in the UK, but in the pursuit of liberalism, we have championed the rights of individuals to the point where common sense has been set aside and democracy has been ignored. So, for example, the right to self-identify as a woman, put it on a pedestal. And so the people who self-identify as a woman now, all they need to do is say, I'm a woman, and they can go and compete against women in sports or go into women's loos, they can go into women's prisons, or they can seek to do all of these things. And I mean, thank goodness for the Supreme Court ruling, which, by the way, many people are not implementing, when the Supreme Court ruled a woman is a woman and a man is a man. That's how far we've fallen as a country. We need a Supreme Court ruling to tell us that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. But liberalism has gone mad. And so, for example, with liberalism, it was liberalism that really put women forward, that emancipated women, made them equal in the workplace, empowered women equally with men, and so on. And it is the same liberalism now that is attacking women by putting men into safe spaces with women, by allowing men to compete against women in sports and so on. Liberalism is out of control. That's one of the problems. And democracy is being set aside. The individual is all important. And we also see this in the rights of illegal migrants who come to this country, foreigners who are treated with exactly the same rights as British citizens. And this comes from the Human Rights Act, where all humanity deserves equal treatment. We've confused the right to certain human protections. We've confused that with an entitlement to everything that a citizen might get and beyond.
Ben, it doesn't seem like equal treatment at that point. It seems like preferential treatment.
It is preferential. And then in the pursuit, as you said in this interview, to be seen to be politically correct, accepting, generous, kind, tolerant society, we're actually going suicidally empathetic, which is the way I think you described it, and throwing our own under a bus and taking in others to, and putting them on a pedestal. So that's another force that's taking place. And then there's a third force. There's at least another force that's got a grip of us, and it is what I would call globalism. After World War II, a number of international agencies were established, like the United Nations. The birth of the European Union came after World War II. The European Convention on Human Rights came after World War II. And these conventions, international bodies, were all designed with good intention in the hope that mankind would therefore never go to war in the way that it had gone to war in World War I and World War II. And that all kind of worked quite well. But instead of us remaining independent nations cooperating internationally for world peace, what's happened is these institutions have now begun to set aside what it means to be a nation state. In the pursuit of globalism, they've actually moved towards setting aside nations. And so being patriotic, being a nationalist, these are all bad things. If you believe in your culture, it's bad. If you want the United Kingdom to be an independent sovereign country, you're clearly against peace. You're a bad guy, because really we should all be part of one kumbaya, happy European Union. But what happens when you do that, when you move towards globalism, is you forget what democracy is. Because you can't have, in order to have democracy, you have to define the democratic unit. What is the democratic unit in a global world? There's no global parliament. The only democracy that takes place is at a national level. And so nations are critically important if democracy is to be upheld. If people are to have a seat at the table of power, it has to be through nation states. And we've been setting aside nation states. And of course, those people who don't believe in nation state, and Starmer's one of them, many people in our governing classes don't believe in the nation state. They don't care for culture, national culture. In fact, they see national culture as an impediment to their goal, because national culture would give people the belief system that would protect the nation state. It's also why they love immigration, because it dilutes down national culture. If you go to the government website, Emmanuel, and you look up what far-right terrorism is, I ask you to do this as before you publish this interview. Go to the government website and look up what the definition of far-right terrorism is. It defines it as using violence for the advancement of far-right ideologies. And then one of the definitions of far-right ideology is cultural nationalism. So if you believe in your culture and in your nation, you're far right. That's the government's definition. So we are in a pickle as a result of liberalism gone wrong, which has become dictatorial, globalism, which is now setting aside nation states, and a failure to understand the differences between citizenry and international, the difference between being a citizen and being a foreigner. These are the three principal things that I think have infected us. But then, of course, if I were to put it all very simply, I would just say we got a bunch of crooks running us. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I touched my cap because I'm sure by many definitions this could be considered far right. So, I mean...
It will be. You will be accused of being a Christian fundamentalist fascist. What do they call it? Not a Christian nationalist. Yeah, a Christian nationalist.
So, interestingly, what is it then about Labour and people who think the way Starmer does and working in these really odd alliances with Muslims and Islamists that very obviously want to establish not a liberal, secular globalist agenda, but a Muslim caliphate, essentially, and that kind of weird alliance? Why do they tend to be co-opted by that?
I think that Starmer, if you buy the whole everyone's equal right across the world and everyone should be therefore treated equally, and they're not the same thing. You can say there are certain human rights which everyone deserves. That's completely different from saying everyone should be treated the same way. British citizens do deserve a better shake of the dice than foreigners do in this country. I'm sorry. It's just the way it is. It should be in any nation state. But if you believe it the way Starmer does, then you can't distinguish between what's right for this country and what's right for the global order. You lose sight of everything. You're hijacked. Your ideology is hijacked. And it comes back really to some way towards the beginning of our conversation, where I said, in order to perpetrate these extreme ideologies, they have to shut down free speech. One of them is an understanding of who we are as a country. That's why they're shutting down free speech. That's one of the reasons, for pesky nationalists, pesky patriots.
Why don't they see that, for example, a lot of the types of fundamental Islam that's growing
Sorry.
in the UK
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
is contrary to that. Do they disagree? Are we wrong about that?
But no, because it would undermine their ideology. Their ideology is everyone's equal. Everyone's capable of assimilation. Everyone should be able to be kumbaya. That's where they start in their belief system. And so when they see forces which are antithetical to their belief system, they say, no, we don't recognize it. That's why they don't report all these rapes that are taking place. You know, Rupert Lowe came out in Parliament the other day and he read some pretty horrific things. I don't know if you saw his speech. None of which was reported on mainstream media. None of it. Rapes of girls taking place in public and no one intervening. I mean, it's horrific. I ask people to go and watch it. None of it reported on mainstream media because it undermines the ideology.
Yeah. On that note as well, one thing that many people would push back on is they'd say, if we were to say Pakistani grooming gangs, you'd often hear people say, well, actually, the majority of perpetrators of these crimes of gang-related grooming offences are white English people, so it's not a uniquely Pakistani or Muslim problem. Do you think that's accurate? And do you think it's right or wrong to describe them as Pakistani grooming gangs, Muslim grooming gangs?
If you look at the number of rapes taking place and the ethnicities of the individuals committing the rapes, then roughly 80+% of rapes are committed by white men. And it goes pretty much with ethnicity. If you look at individual rapes, if you look at gang rapes, it is like 85, 87%, something like that are South Asian origin, mostly Pakistani. The gang raping is definitely a foreign element that's perpetrating it in this country. And it would appear, and I think we've got to be brave about it and not shy away from it, it would appear that the majority of these people who commit gang rapes are from Pakistan. So, for people, again, it challenges the ideology that everyone's equal, everyone can assimilate, we shouldn't be prejudiced, blah, blah, blah. But when someone's proven to you repeatedly, where you've got stats that show 85% of gang rapists are from Pakistan, well, then they are Pakistani rape gangs, aren't they? They are Pakistani rape gangs.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think that is the case? And of course, you're half English, half Pakistani. And you grew up in Pakistan as well, up until 13. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on why that might be the case.
It would be equally wrong to think just because of the Pakistani rape gangs, the rape gangs are 85% Pakistani. The majority of people in rape gangs are of Pakistan or origin. It would be wrong to then make the next leap, which is that all Pakistanis are rapists. I mean, that's a completely wrong leap. I mean, what we're doing in this country, and we're doing it from Pakistan in particular, but also North Africa and other places, is taking in people, allowing people into the country which have never been allowed into this country before, who are uneducated, never had a brush with civilization. We are taking in what I would define as barbarians. And so it shouldn't surprise us if they behave in a barbaric fashion. And again, people aren't prepared to say it because it sounds prejudiced, but they are barbaric. Polite society in Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, and other cities in Pakistan would not allow these people across their own threshold. And yet we're bringing them into the country.
And I think that's a massive part of the problem, where because we might be so scared to paint everybody with a brush, we don't point things out when they ought to be pointed out. So, for example, with the grooming gang scandal, especially with what came out of Rochdale, are you familiar with an organization called Christian Concern?
I think I've heard of it, but just remind me.
So they're an organization. They represent a lot of Christians with legal matters. So, a nurse is sacked for calling a man when he wants to be called a woman. So they'll represent cases like that. But they've published a couple of articles looking at some of the victim statements from the grooming gang scandals. And what the girls will talk about is that it's not just that they were targeted as girls, but that they were targeted for being white English girls. And often the disgusting people who did those things to them would quote verses from the Quran to justify what they do. So they might, for example, talk about how the girls are, they're not Muslim girls, so they can treat them that way. Or the Quran justifies in, for example, chapter 4, verse 34, beating a woman if she doesn't obey her husband, and they'll use these types of things. So as much as, you know, I know many Muslim people who would be disgusted and horrified by those things, which is absolutely true. But at the same time, there are people who do use the religious justification to carry out what they're doing. And it seems ridiculous to me that that would not at least be acknowledged and then specifically addressed in any way.
Yeah,
because if you reversed it, just to say, if there were a significant number of people who went to some of the Old Testament laws that talked about stoning or various things, and then used that as justification to stone people in modern Britain, the Christian community would absolutely condemn that, and they would be livid that that's being used in that manner, but they wouldn't hide the fact that, yes, you can use the Bible in those inappropriate ways.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to simply controlling your borders. And, you know, well, there are two things here, aren't there? The first is that before we came on air, you and I touched on this. Islam tends to be fundamentalist. And you said you kindly listened to the speech I made in the Oxford Union a year and a half ago, in which I said, or it was just over a year ago, in which I said that the challenge with Islam is that the fundamental challenge with Islam, and the reason it's a fundamentalist religion, I think, is that the Quran is the word of God, is dictated to Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. Once you accept, as Muslims do, that the Quran is the word of God, it becomes incapable of being challenged because you can't improve on the perfect. God is perfect. This book must be perfect. And so you can't debate it. It can't evolve. It becomes entrenched. It won't change with changing times. Christianity's greatest strength, and perhaps its greatest weakness as well, as we're now seeing, is a preparedness to change and evolve. And Christianity's greatest strength in the United Kingdom was its ability to remove itself, you know, to allow a secular form of governance, but still maintaining a Christian constitution. People say to me, Ben, you're wrong when you say we're a Christian constitution. I'm not wrong. We absolutely are constitutionally still just about a Christian country. But Christianity has been able to remove itself from, you know, the operations of the state and law and so on. Muslims can find whatever justification they need in the Quran or the Hadith and the subsequent, you know, proclamations. And they can rely on it because it fundamentally doesn't evolve. And there are many, many, many Muslims who wouldn't dream of doing what these barbarians do, but they've been able to find the verses to justify their barbaric acts. And that makes it very challenging for people who, peaceful Muslims who are not rapists, to call them out and to really reveal the issue. And so it does mean that when you're faced with a fundamentalist ideology like that, it's critical that we control our borders very carefully, and we only let in people who, if they are Muslim, come in small numbers, but they are educated, and they understand that coming into this country, they're coming to a Christian country, and they respect the Christian values, the Christian heritage of this country, not try to replace it. And by the way, there are lots of what you might regard as perfectly peaceful, non-violent Muslims who do actually want to change this country into a Muslim country, who do want to do it now. And that must be resisted. And I did a little piece to camera this morning in which I explained how the anti-Muslimness law is going to put a legal protection around Islam, which is a proselytizing, muscular, self-confident religion, on its front foot. It's putting a legal protection around Islam, and no other religion has that legal protection. And through protecting Islam in that way, giving it an advantage in in the United Kingdom, in British society, it will inexorably then become the religion of the state. If that anti-Muslimness law comes in, the United Kingdom will be inexorably heading towards becoming a Muslim state. And again, people watching this video will say he's being alarmist. He's being hyperbolic, but I'm not. If you put a legal protection around an ideology and say it can't be challenged, it will become the dominant ideology because you're not challenging it. And it's converting people to its own cause. Whereas Christianity can be challenged, Hinduism can be challenged, all the rest can be challenged. Are you with me? And
I am.
Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah, so we've got to be brave. We don't have to be divisive. We don't have to pour scorn on peaceful Muslims and throw everyone out of the country and burn everyone on a pyre. But we've got to be brave and say these are the challenges with Islam. These are the challenges with multiculturalism. This is what's going to happen if you put legal protections in place. You've got to call it out for what it is.
So what you said earlier about Islam, and I know the thesis of your Oxford speech is that Islam is incompatible with the West because of the sacred position that the Quran sits in Islam and its inability to move, to change, to adapt, especially through debate, democracy. But then people would say
it's anti-free speech.
Same thing.
It's fundamentally anti-free speech. Yeah.
But then if you took the Bible, for Christians, the Bible is, if you're, the UK being a Protestant Christian constitutional country, not a Roman Catholic, so a Protestant one, the Bible is the highest authority. So though we may discuss and debate how we understand what the Bible says, that still, at least for a Christian, would be the highest authority. So what would you say to that accusation that actually, a Christian constitutional country would be as undemocratic as a Muslim constitutional country?
But it's not true, is it? Because, when I did religious studies at school in England, we focused on the New Testament, which is what Christians focus on, and we focused on the Synoptic Gospels. And the Synoptic Gospels, anyone who studied the Synoptic Gospels, the first thing they learn is that a lot of the teachings are in parables and allegories. They're not meant to be taken literally. This is just expressing it through a parallel. You're also taught that the Synoptic Gospels were passed down originally by word of mouth and that they weren't put into writing until much later. So no one's telling you that the Synoptic Gospels are literally the word of God and you must adhere to them come hell or high water or you will be damned in purgatory forever. No one says that. There's not I'm not aware of a Christian who says that.
It's interesting because I've heard you talk before about, so I heard you on the Heretics podcast talk about William Wilberforce and the fact that it was a Christian conservative who fought to abolish slavery through Parliament, right? So I know many detractors who would say that Christianity in this country has always been oppressive, and it wasn't always the liberal secularists who fought for some of the reforms that we're most proud of. But I would point to someone like William Wilberforce and say he was somebody who believed that the Bible was the infallible word of God, for instance, and pushed for something that which, as a country, we are proud to have seen him done. Not that the Bible is not the word of God and can be subject to change in that manner.
Well, you'll have to ask William Wilberforce what he, he wasn't evangelical.
Yeah.
He was an evangelical Christian. But that aside, at its heart, Christianity is a very forgiving religion. Christ died on the cross for our sins. Christ believed in turning the other cheek. It's not an aggressive religion. It's not it doesn't proselytize in the same way that Islam does. And Judaism, by the way, is the opposite. I've interviewed a number of Jews and they say if you want to become a Jew, they try and deter you. They challenge you. You have to repeatedly declare that you wish to become a Jew before you're allowed to become a Jew. They want to push you away. And Christianity is much more relaxed about the whole thing. But Islam is out there converting people. And it's just, it is a completely different religion.
Yeah, completely different. And as you mentioned from the beginning, the followers of Jesus were witnesses going around and telling people about what they'd seen, often facing persecution, but never at the end of the sword. There have obviously been times during the history of the world that people have spread Christianity through the sword. for sure. But from its origins, that it's always been about witnessing what we know to be true. So
One
Ben,
of the
would you
other good
describe your...
examples, one of the other examples I give, if I may just give it, since you mentioned William Wilberforce, is
Yeah.
the debate between Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Huxley in 1860 in Oxford, I think the Natural History Museum there, where Huxley was making the case for evolution and man being descended by apes, and Samuel Wilberforce, the son of William Wilberforce, who was a bishop, had this debate. But they had this debate in good spirit. There were jokes made during the debate, and they both went off and had supper together afterwards. Now, it's hard to imagine that debate taking place between Osama bin Laden and a purveyor of evolutionary theory, and Osama taking a relaxed view about it. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Would you describe yourself as a Christian?
I'm baptized. My mother's Christian, my father's a Muslim. I call him a lapsed Muslim. I was brought up going to church, singing hymns. At rugby, which is where I went to school, we obviously did all of that. But I would call myself a very, very light Christian. I don't go to church. I don't pray. You probably think I'm a bad guy because of all of that. But I do see, from a political perspective, I see the great benefits that have come to this country through its Christian roots and the patrician Christian forgiving form of the behavior that comes out of that has been so brilliant for this country. And I don't want to lose that, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you think there's much hope maintaining the Christian constitutional distinctions without having a significant number of people in the UK believing the foundations of Christianity?
I mean, it presents
in a sense,
challenges.
why would they defend it?
Yeah. So I think when your nationhood is assured, when your culture is not being challenged, we can afford to take things a little for granted and be a bit laissez-faire in the way that I just described. But I think you're seeing, Emmanuel, and your cap is evidence of it, and my making the case in favor of Christianity is evidence of people now waking up and going, we can't be laissez-faire anymore. We have to fight, proverbially fight, for what we believe in, because it's going to be set aside. So I think what we're going to naturally see in this country is a resurgence of belief in Christianity, because people will be, they're being forced to choose.
Absolutely. I think more people are realizing that the country that we love is not the same as every country around the world.
Yeah.
And what made it what it is was the hard work, blood, sweat, and tears, and love of people who largely believe that Jesus Christ really did live and really did die and really did rise again to pay for the sins of those who believe in him. And that one day, when all this is said and done and we stand before God, the people who can say, a God who actually is there, the people who can say, even though I'm not deserving to be in your presence, because you've forgiven me by your Son, I know you'll receive me and to be welcomed into his heavenly kingdom. Now, many people will disagree with that and think that's wrong and we should keep that out of politics. But one thing's for certain, men who believe that shaped the country, built the schools, the universities, the hospitals, and the very things that we now come to cherish. So I think they might have been onto something.
Yeah. And you need to make a choice, don't you? I'm afraid that my generation has a lot to answer for, because my generation had great prosperity. Our nationhood was never threatened. We never had to think about how it was that we got to the position we were in. We took it for granted. And I took this nation's existence and its belief systems, its values for granted. I didn't realize I got involved in politics when we voted to leave the EU, and then we never left. And my first entry into politics was from a regulatory economic perspective. And it's only through peeling back the onion repeatedly, getting deeper into the issues, that I suddenly really developed a holistic understanding. I think I've developed a pretty good holistic understanding of the real challenges facing us. And the EU is a symptom of just one of the challenges. It's a creation of a much bigger, it's a much bigger problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Ben, what would be your final message for someone who wants to know genuinely, how do we rescue the country from where it's heading, and what can a positive vision for Britain look like?
So the first step we've got to do, the first major step, and it's a huge step, it's a radical step, it's not an extreme step, but it's a radical step, is reversing all the acts of parliament and regulations that have hijacked this country. And that basically, in my mind, goes back to everything that came after the Human Rights Act, came alongside the Human Rights Act and came after the Human Rights Act. We've got to get out of the ECHR. We've got to repeal the Equalities Act. We've got to repeal the Terrorism Act. We've got to repeal the Climate Change Act. We've got to eject international law out of the body of our law. We've got to terminate all the quangos that hijack our democracy. We have to make sure that trial by jury is not abolished, and that the judiciary is held to account. Trial by jury is critical to our democracy. It's the people judging the people. It's absolutely fundamental. Make sure the bishopric are not removed from the House of Lords, which is what Starmer wants to do, because that'll be the end of, then he'll say we're, multi-faith country. Make sure the anti-Muslimness law doesn't come into being. Not because I'm advocating people should be anti-Muslim, but because we don't want Islam to become the religion of the United Kingdom. So there's many fundamental steps that need to be taken from a regulatory and legislative perspective to give us the foundations. A bit like the way I built the party from foundations upwards. The country needs its foundations reset. And we need to go back to a position where we're restored. And then we can start making policies for reformation. Reformation comes after restoration. There's no point reforming until we've first restored.
Ben Habib, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me on.